Hey folks, this is a good friend of mine named Jeff Ferguson, and he was in town this past week. And while he was here, we decided to knock out a couple unexpected projects really fast. This one is going to be an Asian-inspired coat rack. The material we are using here is red oak. More specifically, it's rough sawn red oak. And anytime I'm working with rough sawn lumber, the first step for me is always to lay out the pieces on the board and then rough cut the sections a bit longer than what they need to be at my miter saw station. And as you can see here, this particular board has quite a bit of cup to it, so using it for a project that requires wider pieces, full width pieces, isn't really an efficient use of material because you have to end up jointing and planing away so much of the thickness to get the board flat. So cutting the board into multiple pieces along its width is a much more efficient use of material. With all of the rough pieces cut, the jointer is used to flatten one wide face and then flatten one corresponding narrow face to create a perfect 90-degree corner. Right off the jointer, I like to go to the table saw to cut my pieces to their final width, typically before going to the planer. But I want to show you a error that I had, or point out an mental error that I had while Jeff was using the table saw. I noticed that the dust collector was running, but the blast gate to the table saw was closed and the blast gate to the jointer was open. So without thinking, I went ahead and fixed the blast gate situation, and this was kind of dangerous in two areas. Number one, anytime someone is using a power tool of any kind, it's best to give them a little personal bubble that you stay out of and leave them alone while they're using these tools, so that you don't accidentally scare them or take their attention off of what they're doing, which may potentially cause a dangerous situation. Number two, I had my back to the table saw in an area where he had a couple pieces staged to be used to be cut next. So I could have easily backed into some of these pieces, causing them to move into the dangerous area of the table saw. So just a quick reminder that anytime anyone's using some type of power tool, give them space, don't distract them, and let them do their own thing. It's also a good note to notify anybody else in the household that anytime power tools are being used, to let that person do their thing and kind of leave them alone so they're not distracted and potentially cause a dangerous situation. And finally, we go to the planer to remove the last rough sawn face of the material, running the boards through jointed side face down. This also establishes the final thickness of our material. We started with some 4/4 thick stock and ended up with, if I'm not mistaken, it was 3/4 of an inch thick when it was all said and done. Back at the miter saw station, we can use the stop block to cut the pieces to their final length. The first one is 31 inches. And that's for the long horizontal shelf that's going to be on top. The next piece is going to be 29 1/2 inches, and that is the horizontal piece below the shelf that the actual hooks, the coat hooks, will be mounted to. And then finally, both of the vertical supports, they get cut at 24 inches. The vertical supports are what's going to tie everything together. We wanted to use half-lap joints for the construction, so I switched out my regular blade for the dado stack on my table saw. Now, I often get asked questions as far as how long does this process take, because I do have an extra step for this particular table saw to switch out the brake cartridge, and it really doesn't take that much time at all. This clip is sped up, but in real time this clip was 2 minutes and 53 seconds. Anytime I'm using the dado blade in conjunction with my miter gauge, I always use a sacrificial fence on the miter gauge so I know exactly where the blade is, and I also screw in a piece of just dimensional lumber. This is just a piece of 2x material behind the blade in line with it, so it acts as a dust shroud to throw all of the dust in the cabinet rather than through my sacrificial fence and onto me. Now once the dado stack is properly dialed in with some scrap wood, then I can go ahead and make my cuts. Now I set up a stop block because I knew that I wanted all of these half-lap cuts to start from the same side on each end. That way I can make one cut, flip the board end for end using the exact same stop block setup, and establish the appropriate location on both sides of the boards at the same time. Then it's just a matter of hogging out the rest of the material, making way for the vertical supports. The piece I'm cutting right now is the horizontal piece that the hooks will be mounted to. And we ended up not going with a full half lap here. We cut this particular joint so that it would be a half lap joint, but we wanted them to be a little bit proud We wanted this board to be a little bit proud of the vertical supports on either end, so we ended up just cutting the half lap joint. I guess you can call it a dado joint now. Just cutting the joint in the horizontal piece. Every piece except the horizontal shelf will get some curves on each end, and we weren't exactly sure on all these shapes, so we decided to make a few templates first, and to help us make the curves we used a face shield. This required an extra set of hands, but it worked out really well, and we got a nice subtle curve that we weren't able to get with a regular French curve. And after marking them out, we cut them out on the bandsaw and then flushed everything up to the line on the oscillating spindle sander. Now, this is one of those purchases that I thought I would use, but I've ended up only using twice in the past 6 months that I've had it. So I always recommend people to not purchase anything unless they know for sure that it's needed for a particular project, because in my experience, when you make purchases like this that you think you'll use, you end up not using them hardly at all, and it's money that isn't really well spent. Once we were satisfied with the template, we transferred everything to our project material and repeated the process, starting with the bandsaw to make the curves. Now, we stayed away from the line again, and we made sure that the two pieces that are identical, the left and right vertical pieces, we tape those together so that when they're cut, they remain identical with whatever shape that it is. So after cutting everything on the bandsaw, we went right back to the oscillating spindle sander and sanded down to our pencil line. At this point, Jeff can start the assembly by gluing the lower horizontal piece to both vertical pieces. And this also establishes the final width of the vertical pieces from one another, which we can transfer to the shelf to cut the notches out in the back side of the shelf. Because I already had the dado stack in the table saw, it was really easy to notch out the back side of the shelf. All I had to do is transfer the locations of both vertical pieces with a marking knife, and just be very careful to not pass that marking knife line on these particular cuts. Now, once I had both of these notches cut and everything was fitting just right, we wanted to make the piece a little bit thinner in appearance. So on the bottom three edges of the shelf, we made a 10-degree undercut, leaving about 1/4 of an inch on the top side to make it look like the shelf was thinner than what it is, but still have the same mass of the original 3/4 inch thickness in the middle. Previously glued up joints have been sitting for about a half hour at this stage, but we really didn't want to stress them too much while installing the upper shelf, so we added a couple clamps to hold them together. Now, the upper shelf is installed with no glue and just 2 screws per side, making sure to pre-drill for these screws to prevent any splitting of any kind. Now, for a finish, Jeff chose to use Carrington colored Rust-Oleum stain and top coated that with a couple coats of clear shellac for protection. Once all that dried, the coat hooks can be installed and it can be mounted on the wall in any way you want. You could screw right through the vertical pieces to mount it to the wall, or add hanging brackets in the backside. If you'd like more information on this project, as well as all the dimensions and a free SketchUp file, or if you'd like to know a little bit more about Jeff's channel and what he does, be sure to check out the links in the description below. Thanks for watching, folks, and you guys have a great day.